Hello, I'm Angelina, and welcome back to another episode of our interviews. As always, feel free to open up the transcript or the description to better follow along and learn more about our guest speakers.
Perfect.
Okay, hello, I'm here with Eric. How have you been so far?
Yeah, so far so good. So far so good. I'm actually calling and talking to you from sunny California, the Cupertino area. It's pretty good. All's well. Thank you for having me here, by the way.
Oh, thank
Greatly
you for
appreciate it.
coming.
No worries.
So just to start off, could you share some of your key experiences or like some parts of your journey that have gotten you to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. So funnily enough, when I was younger, I always wanted to be a veterinarian. Probably for the first 16 years of my life, I just wanted to be a veterinarian. Then I ended up going to college. I went to undergrad, Rutgers University. And so I was right in New Jersey, not too far away from New York. And then I found out that I really love the arts just as much as I love the sciences. And so by the time I finished my undergrad, I had decided that I was going to go to London to get a master's in filmmaking. And so I ended up going to London and I started to do documentary work there for about a year or so. And then I came back to do filmmaking in New York and I was doing music videos. That was like my bread and butter. But as you can imagine, it didn't come with health insurance. It didn't come with a 401k. And like eventually you get to a point where those things are kind of important to you. And so I moved to Boston where I was working with MIT and Harvard on a project called edX, which some of you may have heard of, similar to Coursera, any kind of online education. And so there I got really, really saturated into working with scientists, as you can imagine, engineers, aeroastro, AI, you name it, because it's MIT. There was a lot of that going on. I fell in love with doing that kind of work and working with scientists and bringing science education to basically anyone. The motto at the time for edX was education for everyone at any time. And I was like really in love with that idea. And so I did that for about 6 years. And then I got an opportunity to do similar work at Stanford. And so that's what brought me out to California. As you can imagine, Stanford and MIT have a lot of similarities in science, STEM in general, engineering, mathematics. They're all really big in both universities. By the end of the pandemic, I just joined a new team, which is called Stanford Digital Education. And one of my tasks or opportunities was to oversee a bioengineering course that we were creating for Title I high schoolers. And that actually, like for the last 2 years, I've been elbow deep in bioengineering. So it's been a lot of fun, very exciting for sure.
Was there like a specific reason or like a specific event that sort of like influenced you to want to do sort of like this equal education or like focus on bringing education to everyone?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, so I've always kind of believed this idea that most of the challenges we face, that's everything from pandemics, global conflict, all the sort of polycrises that, Gen Z will probably have to deal with at some point, thanks to the generations before. A lot of those things will be resolved when you have more people who are just better informed, better educated, better capable of having the knowledge they need, and then the opportunities for them to act on it. And so I think one of the big things, my whole sort of like adult life, I've lived in one world and worked in another. So like when I was in London, I lived in a really nice part of London, but the documentaries I was making were in impoverished areas. When I lived in New York, so I worked in New York, I lived in New Jersey. Where I lived in New Jersey was impoverished. Where I worked was like a block away from Wall Street. I got to see sort of both sides of that dynamic. Where I live now, as you can imagine, is Silicon Valley, lots of privilege, lots of wealth. But I get to see all the other sort of like surrounding environs that just don't have that same level of privilege. And one thing I've come to appreciate is like the big difference between those two worlds of having and not having usually is like access to really like sound high quality education and then the opportunity to act on it. And so anytime I see an opportunity where I can be a part of that process of getting more people sort of like existentially literate, like just coming to love the act of living, I jump on it because I think that's really where the solutions are going to be for a better future.
Mm, that sounds really cool. Uh, could you sort of like walk us through like how exactly you designed your like educational program and then like what difficulties you face because it's like online and like more digital?
Yeah, absolutely. So the program itself started as a partnership between Stanford University and the National Ed Equity Lab. So two nonprofits came together with this idea again of bringing Stanford, elite education to Title I high schoolers. And so at the time, we were looking at sort of what were the most sort of like relevant topics and where was there an appetite. As you can imagine, intro to CS was one of the first because everyone wants to know how to code. That is basically the future, and I appreciate that. But as we went along, bioengineering percolated, and it's like a beautiful balance that struck between sort of like the biological sciences and technologies. And so you kind of get a little bit of both worlds, which is really exciting. I think students who may not be as comfortable with technology, they can sort of like get a primer into it. So that was one of the things that we ended up doing. And, as we started like developing and designing, my internal team on the bioengineering course, we were asking like, how do we make the content more inclusive? How do we emphasize learning over grading, right? Which is something that I think high schoolers usually have a hard time with because they're constantly being told by adults like, you have to have good grades so you can go to a good college, so you can get a good job. And like, truth be told, it's not to say those things aren't important, but the reality is if you don't have a passion for learning and you're not actually storing information and looking for those opportunities and connections, what ends up happening is you pass the exam and then you forget everything. And that doesn't really get you like forward in the ways that you're hoping. And so we wanted to change that sort of like culture and dynamic. And then we wanted to add compassion into the process. Like our project started in the middle of COVID. And so at that time, a lot of students were already working remotely and they had some complaints about what that experience was like. And so we wanted to make sure that we were more thoughtful and intentional about doing that work. I think now that we've sort of come out of a pandemic, some of the big challenges again are like accessibility. You'd be shocked, or I'd like to think you'd be shocked. I know I was at the number of high schoolers that don't have access to internet. Like that's wild to me. We live in one of the sort of like most financially capable countries in the world, and not everyone has internet, which I take for granted. Again, I live in Silicon Valley, where that's sort of like the bedrock of the internet. I think that's one of the biggest challenges. I think there's also a world where there's a lot of sort of thinking around what is the most meaningful way to like learn, right? Is it experiential learning? And if so, like, can you do that remotely over the internet? And I think there's got to be like almost a hybrid model that we've sort of worked on. So this last year, we actually mailed fold scopes and 3D printers to the schools that we were working with so they could actually do labs. And so that's sort of the experiential side. I think too, a lot of Gen Z, Gen Alpha, you guys are growing up in more remote, more tech informed environment. And so as much as you guys may not like it, or maybe you do, that is going to sort of be the trend going forward. And so learning how to navigate within that space now is a lot easier when the stakes are lower. Once you have a job, like my job, I'm 100% remote. So I actually only go to campus when I need to, but I work remotely. So I'm, in the comforts of my home currently. And most of the people on my team, I think half of us live in California. Everybody else lives in Hawaii and Washington State. We're all over the place, right? And so that gives you a sense of what that looks like. And being a remote team has its challenges. So I think, again, to go back to your question, learning how to work in a globalized, digitized world while you're high schoolers is probably better to learn then. Because when you're an adult, it's like, I think adults are less fond of learning these new modalities. And so, there's a lot of like refining that has to take place as we go along.
Do you think there's like any particular advantages to like being a remote team or like providing education like digitally that you wouldn't have if you were forced to like work in person all the time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest ones is sort of like scale, right? And so when you think about how many students, we're able to reach over 1,000 high schoolers every year, in large part because of the digital access. How many students in New Jersey would be able to afford to come all the way to Stanford for a whole quarter to do one course, right? Like that's probably not economically feasible, nor is it realistic, like, to do that. But now you can have access to a Stanford course, even though you're on the exact opposite coast. So I think that's really nice. I think, you know, we've we've come up with a lot of ways to mitigate for time differences, which always pose a challenge. One of the things that we've done is we have teaching fellows who are Stanford students who act as a proxy to a Stanford faculty member. And so what ends up happening is you can get a Stanford student who happens to be living on the East Coast, in the East Coast time zone. And so they're able to operate within the same sort of time constraints as a school that's also there. And so there's a few ways that it's a little bit easier to mitigate for some of those challenges. But that said, I think the biggest thing is scale. Like we can just reach a lot more people. And like I think you probably already know, like there are times where you're on Instagram and you're swiping and then you're watching something that was recorded in a completely other country at a completely different time. You have complete access to it. I think the same rules apply with education, where it's like you're not dependent on my schedule. It's what works for your schedule. I think one of the things that people often sort of talk about within that space is community building. Like, how do you build a community when everybody is away? And I think there's like a various number of ways to approach that, some better than others. And it's also very contingent on who your population is. So, like, as high schoolers, I don't know what kind of communities like online you guys find a little bit easier to sort of like navigate and still feel a part of. But I know as an adult, there's those worlds where, you know, as crazy as it is, being on sort of like a platform that allows me to engage with a group of my peers at any given time is kind of like, okay, that's enough. Like I feel a part of that community. It's not quite the same way as being in person, but I can leave a message and I know that someone somewhere else will get it and respond to it when they get the chance, which isn't like direct feedback. But again, as an adult, I don't know if I need that in as so much as like I'm working, they're working, so we just kind of meet when we can. So I think that's something just to consider. But I personally think that digital education has a lot of potential. So I'm an advocate, but I'm also biased because I work in the space. So
That sounds good. Sort of on the same note, do you have any suggestions for online resources that like Gen Zers or like Gen Alphas can use to like their advantage?
yeah, absolutely. So I won't lie, I started to make a list before coming to this call just because there's so many. One of the big things that I can push for, especially for STEM folks, people who are interested in STEM, citizen science is something that's completely sort of like undiscussed, but it's an amazing opportunity. So basically, what citizen science is that you as a citizen can work with a scientist who's doing a research project at any time, anywhere in the world for the most part, depending on what the ask is. And you're helping them collect data. And that data can look like photos, text, whatever the case is. So to give you a more tangible example, there's a group of scientists right now here at Stanford and in the surrounding area, and they're looking at ocean health. And so basically they ask citizens to record whenever they see a certain kind of mollusk. And so it's like, if you go to the beach and you see it, take a picture, send it to us. And the idea there is that they're trying to aggregate all of that information to figure out where this population of mollusk actually sort of like, is it too high? Is it too low? Is it just right? And you're a part of that. And like now you're actively engaging and like, to sort of make the point finer, they're going to use that information to better understand the health of the ocean in our area and the impact of you know other environmental issues like climate change or increases of pollution, pollutants going into the water. Like, you're a part of actually changing the world for the better in a way that a singular scientist may not be able to do to scale if it wasn't with the help of citizen scientists. And so with that said, one of the big things I would recommend, there's something called Coast Snap. And I'll share links and things like that with you afterwards. But Coast Snap is actually a citizen science group here that's working on ocean health. So I do that. For those who like podcasts, The Wild with Chris Morgan, I'd highly recommend. He makes the story of the environment super exciting. He goes both sort of like far afield in places that we may not normally go, but then he also addresses wildlife concerns more locally. And so like that's always worth doing it if you're interested. Um, Articles that I would recommend. There's actually one from Designer Fund, which again I can share links, and it's called The Jetsons. Now 60 years old, is it iconic by future tense? And basically the idea here is like when I grew up, the Jetsons was even before me. So it's well before you guys. You guys might not even know what the Jetsons are, but animated series that sort of talks about a family living in the future. And it's like all of that was done in like, I think the 30s or the 50s or something, way back in the Hanna-Barbera days. And it informed, like they used to have a robot as their maid. As you can imagine, we now have robots sort of acting similarly. Um, for all you Roomba owners out there, that probably was inspired in some part by the Jetsons. I think I read an article and there's a ridiculous number of inventions that we have today that were originally sort of introduced to us by the Jetsons. So like you and I right now are talking on Slack. We can see on Zoom, we can see each other's faces. That was something that was normalized by the Jetsons. This idea of being able to see someone's face on your phone. At the time that it happened, people were still using rotary phones. So like that seemed like impossible and super futuristic. And now here we are. We take it for granted that it's easy to have that. So I'd highly recommend reading that to just better understand what the future is capable of being. There's a company out here called Sway that uses seaweed to replace plastic and create, all kinds of fabrics. Super fascinating. Got to work with the CEO at one point. Such an amazing story. So again, I'll share a link, but how Sway is turning seaweed into plastic and designing a more sustainable future. And I think these are the kinds of touch points that Gen Z and Gen Alpha should be looking at, is like, how are people right now doing what needs to be done to make the future better? Then do that. Like, you guys should just do more of that, because like the world can be a lot better. And sadly, some of the mantle or the responsibility is going to land on you guys. And you are at a good time now to do that work. The only other one I'll say after is Stanford actually has a design school called the D School. And they have a resource tab on their website that has all these amazing resources that STEM folks can utilize. They're like creator kits. So they actually show you how to make your own everything basically at home or in a group or at school. And so I would highly recommend leveraging that. And again, like I said, I'll share as much of these links as possible to make life easier for you.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much. Are there any last thoughts or pieces of advice you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think the most important thing I can say I know that it can be easy to be overwhelmed by all the different headlines that are coming your way when it comes to sort of like all the different things that are ailing our society. I'm not going to downplay that there's a lot of work to be done, but what I will say to contextualize things is like when I was growing up, we were receiving a lot of those same messages as well. Like a lot of the headlines had sort of a scare factor to it. I think humans are predisposed to wanting to know where danger is. And so there's a little bit of psychology when you have like those clickbaitish titles. But I think you guys are at a really amazing time. Technology is advanced dramatically. You guys have more access than even my generation had. And so I think if you're willing to not be limited just by what your school can teach you, but like go out and learn as much as you can about everything. Like STEM really should be called STEAMer, right? So science, technology, engineering, art, math. Then the ER at the end that I've added is like entrepreneurship and research. If you can merge all of those together and find the verticals that make sense for you and know that you can sort of dibble and dabble in each of them, I think you'll find happiness for one as an adult, but you'll actually make real valuable change for society at large.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your experience with us.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.